Hello. This tutorial is how to create a high dynamic range image or an HDR image. I'm going to show you a fairly traditional HDR image, and we're going to do it entirely in Photoshop. Just to let you know that there are other programs that are devoted entirely to this process, but since we don't have them, I'm going to go through Photoshop, and I think Photoshop does a pretty fine job. What you have here is an image of a sand factory or something. It divides up sand, something like that. And it was taken early in the day, and the reason why I took this is it's one example of how HDR can really work for you. HDR images are the best HDR images are images in which the uh, dynamic range of the image exceeds the dynamic range of the image sensor of your camera. So what you see here is you see a fairly dark factory, and you see a fairly light sky. So no single image can capture the image detail in any one area. Here we have a very dark one over here, and you can see a lot of the sky detail, but the factory is almost gone. Here we get to see the factory in its full splendor, but the sky is completely blown out. So HDR is a way of having your cake and eating it too. But in order to do that, you're actually going to have to take a series of images, and this series of images that I'm showing you here is a group of images taken at progressively lighter and lighter exposures, such that you pretty much have the whole dynamic range. So what I usually do is I start with something that the camera, or some image that the camera says is properly exposed, and then I'll go two stops below. So this is the darkest one, which is two stops below. One stop below the actual correct image, one stop above, and two stops above. So with these five, I'm able to get the full dynamic range. And for you to do this assignment, you'll have to take an image that has a wide dynamic range, and you'll have to take 5 images. It is probably best for you to use a tripod so that nothing moves, or some other way of making your camera stable. All right, so once you've done that, you're going to need to now merge these into a single object so you can make use of the full dynamic range. And the way that you would do that is you would select the darkest through the lightest, and in this case, since they're all together, I'm going to just shift click and I will open up all 5 images simultaneously. And if these are JPEGs, JPEGs are relatively easy because I can double click on them and they will open them up in Photoshop. However, if you have RAW files, they will default to opening in RAW. And you can either stay in RAW, or the best bet really would be to go to File and then Open With. And in this case, instead of RAW, you would be picking Photoshop CS6. But in this case, I have JPEGs. So now that all 5 are selected, I can just double click and they will all open up in Photoshop, and you can see them across the top here. They're all opened up. All right. So once they're all opened up, we now have to combine them together. I'm going to move this up a little bit so you can see everything. And the way you do that is to go to File and Automate and excuse me, Merge to HDR Pro. So File, Automate, Merge to HDR Pro, and then it now asks you, okay, what do you want to merge to HDR Pro? Since all the files are open right here, all I have to do is click this Open Files tab or Add Open Files tab, and it will choose the 5 that I have open, and then I can hit OK, and it will merge them for me. And that's what's happening right now. All right, and now I have a Merge to HDR window. You might not have this screen. You might actually have the screen that says 16-bit, which gets you all these interesting sliders, and that's kind of tempting to use. However, we have much more functionality if we open this whole thing up in Camera Raw later on, rather than working on the few paltry sliders that we have here in 16-bit mode. So if your mode right here says 16-bit, what I suggest you do is move it to 32-bit and then hit OK. But before I hit OK, I want you to show you this is not necessarily how the image is going to show. It's just showing one part of the image. This slider will show you the full range that we have. I'm saying I'm moving the slider. So this shows you the full, all the information this 32-bit image has, right? Much more information than any single Photoshop image would have. It's combining all 5. So I hit OK, and it creates this file in Photoshop. And here it is. Now this file in Photoshop, again, it has all the information that we need. Right now we're seeing some areas that are blown out, but that's not to worry about that, because what's going to happen is that we can, through sliders in Camera Raw, we can bring back all that image detail that seems to be missing, because it is in fact all there. But in order to open up in Camera Raw, we're going to have to put it in a file format that Camera Raw recognizes, and the only one that supports 32-bit is a TIFF file. So what we're going to do is go to File, Save As, and I'm going to navigate to my folder which says HDR. I'm going to call this Factory. Could have called it Sand Factory. And instead of Photoshop, I'm going to save it as a TIFF. And then I'm going to click Save. And this is important. The TIFF dialog box, just make sure that 32-bit float is on and no compression. And this is going to be an interweaved, and IBM PC is fine. So you hit OK, but make sure that 32-bit is there. You hit OK, and it opens it up right now as a 32-bit file. Now we're still in Photoshop, so I'm going to just minimize that for a second. And I'm going to go back to Bridge, and since I saved it, and I saved it in HDR, somewhere in here I should have something called Factory TIFF, and on the bottom is the Factory TIFF file. So if I double click on it now, it would default to Photoshop. So what I want to do instead is go up to this icon, which is the Open in Camera Raw, and since Camera Raw does recognize TIFFs, it will work just fine. So here I am, and usually what will happen in an HDR file is you have all this information, but you can't see all of it. You see some parts are too dark and some parts are too light, and so what I tend to do in Camera Raw is I tend to bring down the highlights so I can get this image detail that's lost, and bring up the shadows so that I can get this image detail that's lost. And so that's what I'm going to do in the sliders over here. I'm going to move this up just a bit. Okay, so I'm going to bring down the highlights, bringing up all that imagery. I'm also going to bring down the whites, which is the very white areas, and I'm getting some of the image detail in the whites. Okay, that's about right. Now in the shadows, I'm going to bring up the shadows to get all that information. Again, all that information was hiding there. In a regular image, that information would be just gone, would just be blanked out. And maybe some blacks, which is a very extreme area as well. Okay, so it's a little flat right now, so I might want to bring up clarity, which makes, it's kind of like a contrast slider, but only for the contrast in the middle areas. And I might want to bring up vibrance. Now vibrance, the difference between vibrance and saturation is vibrance does make things more colorful, but in a more controlled way. I would tend to use vibrance, especially if I'm doing portraits, because the skin tends to stay the same color as regular skin, as opposed to turning bright orange. So I'm going to bring up vibrance, and you can start to see that we're bringing in some interesting colors over there. Since I'm making kind of an over-the-top HDR image, I don't care if it's a little bit out of the color gamut. All right, so this might be all that we can do in Camera Raw, which is enough. We have exposure. We haven't really played with that, but I think the exposure was pretty good to start with. Contrast we might consider playing with, but my fear is losing a little bit of image detail. We might start blowing out stuff if we do that. So right now I would like to open it up in Photoshop and put some of the finishing touches on it. So I'm going to open the image, and we should be seeing Photoshop. Oh, here we go. And this is our image in Photoshop. All right. So one area that we have some image detail here. It's kind of amped up. What I would kind of like to do at this point to kind of go full HDR is to kind of exaggerate some of this. And we're going to do it through a procedure that is usually used for sharpening, but in this case we'll actually bring out some of the image detail in HDR. And it's more like a clarity slider. So what we're going to first do, and you're going to have to just follow along, the best way to do this is through keyboard commands. So the first thing we're going to want to do is make a new layer, and that's easily done. You just kind of click down here to create a new layer, and here's a new layer. And once this new layer and the new layer is selected, what you want to make is something called a stamp visible layer. And this is a layer that we're going to use to modify the layer below it. All right, so a stamp visible layer, you have to press Shift Option Command E. Let me say that again. That's Shift Option Command E. And once I do that, you get another layer, and it looks pretty similar to the layer below, but what we're going to do with it is what's important. So once we have that layer, we're going to turn this into a mask that's going to actually sharpen or actually increase vibrancy. So first thing we want to do is desaturate this layer, and the way that you desaturate, or the easiest way you can desaturate or turn it into a black and white layer, is to hit Shift Command U. Shift Command U gets us there, and look, it's a desaturated layer. All right. Step 3 in that process, we've been mostly in normal blending mode, and I haven't talked about blending too much right now. However, what it does is it determines how the top layer blends into the bottom layer. And what we're going to do is, instead of normal blending layer, which just means it's sitting on top of the background layer, I want it to blend in a specific way. And the way I want it to blend right now is through linear light. So I hit normal, I go to linear light, and I get this kind of really hyper intense change. Now that's not where we're going to stop. We're actually going to turn on a, we're going to go to the filter menu and go to high pass, other. So we're going to go to filter, other, high pass. And some of you have already used this as a means of sharpening, although this is going to be somewhat different. So once I hit filter, other, high pass, I have this now high pass filter with a slider. And notice what's happened already with this high pass slider is I have much more detail. Things are almost a little crunchy, but the difference in the tonalities are much greater. So, and I can move the slider around, and you can get these weird halos that are associated with HDR. I find that these are a bit over the top, so I like to get it just so that I get a little bit more image separation, and then I hit OK. Alright, so compare before to after, and you start seeing what's happening. And if it turns out that you did maybe more than you want to, I think that's not such a bad idea, because you can actually go to the opacity slider and bring down the opacity a little bit to just calm that down if you want to. All right, so we're most of the way there, and you can do a variety of other things now. We're kind of at the point where you could stop, or you can kind of go whole hog. You know, you can go, you can bring up the vibrance here. You know, add a little bit more vibrance if you want to, maybe a little saturation if you want to. You can go here and through curves, you could actually increase the contrast, but in a little bit more controlled way if you want. There's a whole lot of things you can do. However, I think I'll stop here for now. If you have any more questions, please see me in class.